What do young students and the youth of America think about Trump? You might be surprised. Joining us now, Austen Fletcher, host of Fleccas Talks, a star on the YouTube channel with hundreds of thousands of young followers. Austen, welcome.
Hey, Jack. Thanks for having me on.
So tell our viewers, for those who might not know you, and I'm sure that's only a small group of my audience, tell us what you do. Enlighten our audience as to exactly what you do.
Absolutely. So I created a channel called Fleccas Talks where I go interview. It started off with me interviewing protesters once the election happened in 2016. And the channel's kind of morphed over the years. So originally it was kind of showing, how radical the protesters were and how uninformed they were. And now I'm actually, talking to more college kids, and it's more about just kind of engaging the other side and just kind of seeing where they stand when it comes to certain issues. And lately I've been talking a lot about Trump, and I've realized that the radical progressives have attached themselves to liberals, and also they've attached themselves to apolitical college kids. So I think now anyone on the left side of the spectrum thinks they're all on the same team, but realistically, the radical progressives are the ones who are unable to admit that Trump has done any good.
You're seeing, so that's an interesting point. So it's not just the politically astute and aware college kids, which is always going to be a small minority, but it's the vast, uninformed, apolitical, non-political kids. They, if I hear you correctly, they almost feel like if they were to come out conservative, that's almost the equivalent of like being anti-gay or anti-global warming or something like that, that they view as terrible. So they can't be that way, even though they're not political. Is that accurate?
Exactly. And the radical progressives have made it that way. But I think the issue is that a lot of these rational, apolitical people, they don't know much about politics, but they just assume that they're slightly left-leaning. Oh, I don't know much about politics, but
It's groupthink. It's classic groupthink is setting in, and the liberals are more successful at using groupthink among young people than conservatives are.
Yes, exactly. And the reality is that right now the political spectrum has skewed so much. I always say anyone to the right of Ellen is pretty much a conservative at this point.
So let me ask you this. For me as a conservative strategist, for those of us on the right, what do you see? What would be your strategic counsel? Are young people, are they lost? We should cut the rope, forget about them, and focus on other demographics. Can they be converted? Do we need to do better marketing? Do we need to do better polling? What do we need to do to recapture the nation's youth? Like if you go back to the 80s and 90s, in the 80s, Ronald Reagan did a pretty darn good job capturing the 18 to 35. In fact, he did an excellent job. And then in the 90s, people like Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum and DeLay, they didn't do the job Reagan did, but they also did a decent job getting young people. They might have split the vote with the Democrats. But in the last 20 years, we've lost them all. What do we do?
Personally, I think the move is to engage the previously unengaged. A little over 50% of eligible voters don't vote. And I've noticed that a lot of people on the right have been making it their duty and their calling to debate, leftists and, shut down leftists, which is good. It's always good to engage. But I think it's easier to wake someone up who wasn't the most political and have them realize that they have more in common with the modern conservative than they do with the progressive mob. And once they have something in common with us, they'll be disenfranchised by the mob, and they won't be progressive enough for the mob, and they'll become political refugees, if you will. And we'll have to scoop these people up. So my goal has been engage the previously unengaged, and just kind of show the differences we have with that they have with the progressive mob. I don't think these college kids are as progressive as they realize. Progressivism has gone so off the rails lately. So I think as long as we have something in common with these people and we can offer them a nice community, a nice culture, we'll win a lot of people over from the radical progressive agenda.
We used to have on our show, before she went away to college, a beautiful young woman by the name of Jenkins Fox. She used to come in and talk about perspectives on young people. She was liberal, I was conservative. We did a little debate. She was a big Bernie Sanders supporter. And this is a number of years ago, and I would ask her, why do you like Bernie? Do you like his views on the environment or gay rights or the economy or Green New Deal, or what is it that makes you love Bernie? And she would say, no, it's none of those things. We kids love Bernie because of free college. Is that the ticket here? Is that really what undergirds all of it? Maybe these kids are more utilitarian than we think. Is it really all these issues like the Green New Deal and gay rights and San Francisco progressivism, or is it free college?
It is the free stuff, to be honest. A lot of these younger kids feel disenfranchised. They feel like, for the first time, they're not going to do better than the generation before them. So they want that head start. They want, people to value what they value. And for some reason, they think getting a college education is like the key to success, which clearly
let me ask you
it's not.
You said the business of the generation. That's an interesting point. Let me ask a deeper question here. I'll go off the rails a bit. I will digress. It would seem to me maybe the problem with young people is part and part of a broader issue, and that is, do conservatives need to reconceptualize and represent the American dream? Because you're saying, we're not going to do as well as our parents. At some point, you can't, no matter how successful a society is, not Rome, not Britain in the 19th century, not us today, not ancient Greece, you can't have a straight line up of each generation beating the next. Otherwise, we go into outer space, right? We've become a phenomenally successful $20 trillion economy, now bigger than the entire European Union, which has actually gotten bigger in the last 20 years combined, and probably twice the size of China, which has 4 times the population. Bottom line, the United States has done pretty well. Maybe this business of you doing better than your parents is just a bit too much, and we need to represent the American dream. Is that part of what the problem is generally, and then part of what the problem might be with young people?
I think so, because I think a lot of people, their parents did pretty well. They grew up with some sort of economic privilege in a way, and they feel like they now have to either give it away or redistribute it. And it's unfortunate because a lot of the things they want to do and a lot of things they want to give away took a lot of years for a lot of families to achieve. And now they kind of want to, start everyone off on the same page, whether they immigrate here legally or illegally. And they're kind of giving away the American dream. So, I agree. The American dream kind of needs to be, remodeled and rebranded.
That's a good word, remodel. That's a better word than I use. Remodel the American dream. I like that. That can relate. That would be good for pollsters. We're going to present the remodeled American dream. So tell us what you do, Austen. I love this. So you go to college campuses, you go all over the place, and you hand out and you film yourself handing out literature that says, here's why Trump is good, and you get all the jeers and sneers. Tell us about some of those things. I think our audience would love it.
Yep. So my last video I did was about the Russian collusion delusion. I handed out some flyers about, the whole Russia investigation, what ended up happening there. And then I did Trump's Not That Bad before that. And then I did one about Jussie Smollett.
And what's the reaction? Tell us. I'm so curious.
Effective.
What kind of reactions, like with the stuff you hand out about Russia collusion delusion, for instance, what kind of reaction do you get from the kids?
My goal was to go right up the middle with it. So I wasn't going to, super pro-Trump. I wasn't going super anti-Trump. I was just trying to get kids to agree that it's good that the president of their country did not collude with the Russians to overthrow their political system. So I tried to polarize on the radical progressives. So the only people that were disagreeing with me were people that wanted Russia collusion to be true, or they were saying, I don't trust Robert Mueller, even though they trusted him for 2 years or 3 years almost. So the goal is to go as up the middle as possible so as many people as possible can agree with it. And that's the same with Trump's Not That Bad. Like I would tell people, creating 5 million new jobs, that's good, right? Or like defeating ISIS, that's good. And they would say something, he did this or he said this. And I'd say, that's fine. I'm just saying he's not that bad. Can you agree with that? And the only people that wouldn't be able to agree that Trump's not that bad were the radical progressives. They would kind of lose their mind a little bit and get a little crazy. So it was good because anyone who's apolitical and watching, maybe they don't know their political views, but they know who they don't want to be.
What are some of our tools for engagement? Now, you say we engage them, whether it's talk about college costs or other things, but what are our tools? How would you recommend if you were sitting in a room, not with Trump, but if you were sitting in the room maybe with U.S. Senate candidates in certain states talking about the 2020 and 2022 races, how would you advise them to engage with young people? Like a Republican candidate might say, we're just going to write off the 18 to 35. Those aren't our voters. If we get 10% of them, that's great. We'll move on to other things. How would you recommend engaging? What steps would you advise them to take?
I would recommend that people, I think right now the media has kind of polarized us and try to convince everyone that we're all far left and all far right. I think if we try to engage people right up the middle, where a majority of Americans are, especially Americans that don't vote, I think that's going to be the best bet right there. Because I think the media is going to be off the rails for 2020 as well. We can all expect that. But I think a lot of people in the middle who maybe weren't the most political before, I think they want to return to normalcy. They want a more moderate approach, from either side. And I think the only side right now that can offer that is the right. So I think the move would be to engage the previously unengaged and just present a more moderate approach, a return to normalcy, no more radical progressive agenda, and kind of polarize on the radical progressive agenda and ask, do you want to pay, 80% taxes? Do you want to abort a baby that's been born already? Do you want to bring people across the border illegally, let them stay? Like a lot of normal people who don't follow politics, they'll say no to those things. And once you do that, they're not progressive enough for the mob anymore. So now they're kind of political refugees, and we can scoop those people up for 2020. So my plan would be engage the previously unengaged and shoot right up the middle.
Austen Fletcher, host of Fleccas Talks, star of the YouTube channel, hundreds of thousands of followers, teaching us every day how to win back the young vote for the right. Thank you, Austen. If we're real lucky, we'll be able to have you back again.
Absolutely.
See you soon. Joining us now, Joel Block, financial expert, entrepreneur, hedge fund manager, venture capitalist, all-around Wall Street dude, and host of The Inside Track. We're going to talk all about Stephen Moore, the new appointment to the Fed board, and more broadly, the Federal Reserve. Is it an evil institution? I tend to think so. We'll see if our guest agrees. Joel, welcome.
Jack, thanks for having me on.
Well, good, Joel. We love it. We love your programming, and we everybody should to The Inside Track. I encourage all of my viewers and listeners to tune in because I think it's essential if they want the inside track. But let me ask you this. I have been and perhaps you have too, I don't know, but I've been a longtime critic of the Federal Reserve. I mean, the initial purpose of the Federal Reserve, I mean, you can't just have a mint, right? Maybe we should explain to our viewers what all this is, because when the average person hears the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, they don't even know what that is. I mean, okay, the mint makes money. You can't just have the mint dump the money out. The Federal Reserve, the initial purpose was to put the money into circulation, and then, at least in the 20th century, to determine a national interest rate. Originally, there were regional interest rates. Now, in the integrated economy, after about 100 years ago, we have a national interest rate. But the Fed, the problem is that the Fed has gone way beyond its basic functions. And it has gone way beyond just interest rates and the money injector to be regulator of the economy. And I just love it where you have Fed meetings where they sit around and talk about unemployment and inflation and what the perfect level of unemployment should be and what the perfect level of the stock market should be. They don't realize it, or maybe they do realize it. It sounds like a collectivist discussion from Stalin's Russia in the 30s. You agree?
Well, that's sort of what it is. I mean, they have an awesome amount of power. It's and I remember when they reading that when they established the Federal Reserve that people were nervous that this was going to happen, and sure enough, it did. And the thing is that the White House is very deliberately independent of the Federal Reserve, but the Federal Reserve doesn't know what they don't necessarily have the political interest of where the country should go, and they don't have the heartbeat of what's going on. So, for the listeners, the Federal Reserve's job, the money is the fuel, and it takes a lot of fuel to power the economy, but you have to have a carburetor that regulates how much of that gasoline is going to get into the engine, because otherwise you just end up with all sorts of problems. And the Fed's job is to be that carburetor, right?
Let me ask you this: you wind up with all sorts of problems, or do you? What would happen if we drastically took the Fed back to its 19th century role, early 20th century role, and we let the market determine interest rates? What happens if you say problems, but that's a commonly held belief on both sides of the aisle, but what would happen if you did that?
Markets are not perfect. Over time, everything would be fine. I think that over time, you're right, but things don't happen, easily. And our whole economy is so big, and there's so many things riding on every aspect of the economy that if this got out of control for even for a month, while the markets were kind of calming down, if a bunch of money got put in, just dumped in, even a short amount of time would cause just tremendous problems. So I think that a little bit of slowly but surely sometimes works better.
When you say problems, though, I thought you were going to say would cause tremendous disruption. And I was about to say,
well,
isn't that what capitalism is? It's supposed to be disruptive. And my next question was, if we hadn't had disruptions in the 19th century, maybe we wouldn't have had the 20th century. And because we limited disruption in the 20th century, maybe now we're not going to have the 21st. Is that what's going on? Just a thought.
Well, listen, this is an interesting and hypothetical discussion, but the kind of disruption that we all want to have is positive disruption. If there was the kind of disruption where, regular workers couldn't get paid, we would have revolt. So there needs to be a certain amount of regularity and predictability. Part of the problem that we have with the stock market is that the markets are having a little trouble getting a sense about some predictability. And these are the kinds of issues that make people nervous. And when people get nervous, they pull back. And when they pull back, numbers go down. So I think to a certain extent, the Fed has a very important job in just regulating how much fuel gets put onto the fire. But at the same time, they've really way, way overreached their power. And they're making decisions that they should be left to politics.
That's well said. I think that's very well said. You might be my choice. Maybe a President Berkman would choose Joel Block for head of the chairman of the Fed. Let me ask you this: Stephen Moore now being picked for the board. What do you think of Stephen?
I don't have a strong opinion. It's a brand new appointment, so I don't really know. I've just read, a little bit. I don't have a much opinion about this just yet. Okay,
that's fair. I kind of like Stephen. I think he's a good capitalist. I don't know what his experience in government is. I think we should. Trump may have started him about right, not going for chairman, but just put him on the board and see what he does, and maybe someday he could be a Fed chairman. How do we reform the Federal Reserve? Okay, so let's assume looks like Donald Trump will be reelected. If we have Trump will have a second term, can really take a lot of things out for a spin. Should reform of the Federal Reserve Board be something he looks at, presses Congress for?
Given what we're talking about, that the Federal Reserve really overreaches its powers, and that they have a sense about how they want the stock market to grow, they have a sense about what they want unemployment to be, those really should not be in the purview of the Federal Reserve. They should really be in the purview of the politicians who work with the Federal Reserve to execute those policies. I think that we kind of have it backwards. So I'd be in favor of there being some level of reform.
One of the problems I have with my friend Paul Ryan, and I've known him for 25 years or more, longer than that, is just, he talked about Fed reform for not 1 decade, but 3 decades since he was in high school, I think. And when he took over, I and others presented this idea to him, and he suddenly ran away. He suddenly ran away from it, much in the same way he ran away from Social Security reform and Medicare reform.
Yeah.
It's like he suddenly forgot he had ever talked about Social Security. We said, Paul, you've said the Fed is evil for 30 years. Now we control strongly both houses of Congress, and there's a conservative Republican president. Maybe we should reform the Fed. And suddenly the only thing out of Paul was, well, we need to pick our battles. And I said, well, you're not picking any battles.
Yeah.
And I
think what we need to reform. I think we need to reform our representatives is what we need to reform. The idealism of politics, I think, is different than the reality of it. And that's something that's hard for outsiders to understand. I mean, you're a lobbyist, you're an insider, but for those of us who are, not behind the curtain like you are, it's really hard to understand what's really going on there.
I couldn't agree more. Well, okay, so where do we go now? So if you look at, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the Fed in the broader context of U.S. economic policy. Where do you see this going? So the Fed's, it sounds like we're both kind of conceding the point that the Fed's regulatory power will grow and grow and grow. And then the argument becomes, well, because there are these central banks all over the world, we can't diminish our power because we got Mario Draghi at the EU Fed and the Canadian Fed and the Japanese Fed and the Chinese Fed now and all these things. We need one just to keep up with them. And now we get locked into this world of government control where everything becomes an argument. Well, they're doing it, so we have to do it. It's almost like riverboat gambling in the neighborhood state, right? Isn't that what? If we don't have gambling, they're going to go over the border and do it.
But listen, but that's true. It is true. In 2008, when the banks were crashing and the government stepped in and said, that these banks are too big to fail. And, a lot of us thought, well, gee, if they're too big to fail, maybe they're too big to be in business.
That's it, baby.
But and that was originally my posture. But you know what? the economy is so large that it takes those giant banks in order to help them with the treasury functions that are necessary for them to continue on in their businesses. Because businesses become global. We don't have a United States economy. We have a world economy. And we have to be very mindful of the fact that the economy is bigger than most of us can fathom.
Well, you know, though, you're conceding in that argument, you know what you're conceding. You're conceding that globalism spells the death of capitalism. That's what that argument is,
no,
right?
I don't think so.
No,
I don't think that. I don't think that I think that the capitalist economy ultimately will be the whole world. I mean, there may be some countries that are fighting it right now, but I think ultimately they're all coming around over time. You know, there may be some political differences, but over time, I think more countries than less are going to be moving in the direction of capitalism.
See, I think there was an easy solution in 2008. George Bush got frightened. Everybody took him into a room, and he wasn't the brightest turnip in the field. He's probably one of the dumbest turnips in the field. They took him into a room, and they frightened him, and they said, "You're going to be Herbert Hoover if you don't act." And Paulson took him in and sat him down like a little boy, and he got scared, and he signed everything. That's basically what happened. President Berkman, this is what I would have done. I don't know what President Block would do. This is what I would have done. I would have said, look, we have statutory obligations to guaranteed depositors. For the banks, we're going to step in. For the largest banks, we're going to put in some money to make sure they're solvent. For the investment banks, we're going to watch what happens. If we see something like Goldman Sachs failing, maybe the government can put in a small amount. However, if I were doing that, I would put on my hat as counsel to the taxpayers, and I would say, if you want this money, and if indeed your survival is truly at stake, you will accept draconian terms whereby you pay back to the American people lots of profits. And I would have insisted on dramatic paybacks. And you know what they would have said? They would have said no to that. And you know why they would have said no to that? Because they were liars and they really weren't in danger of collapsing. That's my theory.
Exactly. And then what would have happened is then they would have gone after an alternative, because those guys are professional fundraisers. They know how to get the money, and they could get so that once they have
they bring in Chinese money. They would have brought in Chinese money the next morning.
Exactly.
Bingo.
Right, exactly, because they know what the alternatives are, and they know how to weigh and measure. Most businesses don't know how to acquire capital, but they do.
They do.
And they could have gone out and they could have acquired alternative capital, and it would have been better for the United States taxpayers.
But with Bush and Obama, they had Dumb and Dumber. And they came in Dumb and Dumber, Dumbo the elephants, two of them. They came in, they signed every check, they signed every bill, and I don't know which one is the dumbest, but they all gave away money. They all gave away money. Yeah. They gave away $1 trillion. They made Wall Street even richer. You know, Wall Street, I love these arguments. They say, well, nobody could have foreseen how complex these housing derivatives were. The only thing the banks were doing was gambling. I mean, Goldman Sachs might as well have been betting on the Steelers and the Patriots, right? It's the same thing. They're just, they're at the blackjack table.
Yep. That's for sure.
I think we have kindred spirits here. These are kindred spirits. I think if we're real lucky, we'll be able to have you back again. Joel Block, financial expert, entrepreneur, hedge fund manager, venture capitalist, and host of the Inside Track that you've got to tune into.
The podcast is called Profit from the Inside.
That's an even better title. Yeah. I like it. Profit from the Inside. Got it. You now know what a President Berkman would do in a financial crisis. Keep that in mind. We take your questions as we do 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Jim in Wisconsin writes, it's easy for conservatives to bash socialism. We're living in an incredibly prosperous time for America, and the policies offered by people like Bernie and AOC are clearly awful. Yes, they are. But they're very popular, especially among millennials. Why, despite being relatively great in America, is socialism becoming increasingly popular? We just did a segment like this on Behind the Curtain. You got to tune in to find out what the answer is, but I'll give you a little foretaste of the feast here, Jim. The reason is that we're not properly educating our young people. Our young people are being bullied. That 18 to 35 demographic is being bullied into accepting this mindless socialism, these stupid ideas like the Green New Deal and everybody can have free college and let's tax the rich at 99% and let's destroy the rich and the society will be better. We're losing the battle among young people. We as conservatives need to do better to win them back, but much more on that. Tune into Behind the Curtain. You'll love the segment we just did. Okay, make sure. Here's what you all have to do. Got a homework assignment. Go to our website, BehindTheCurtainRadio.com, and get that podcast. Now, go to YouTube if you're there. Hit the bell for the podcast. Also, BehindTheCurtainRadio.com. Go to the website, jump into the ring, and square off. Square off in the ring and take part in our polls. BehindTheCurtainRadio.com. Ken in California writes, by the way, we welcome Bill. We welcome Jesus again. We welcome Mark. We welcome Ted. And we welcome Susie. Thanks for joining us. Ken in California. Democrats have been complaining that the system is rigged since 2016. Well, they always say that. Nominees are running on promises of abolishing the Electoral College and reforming campaign finance. If they win in 2020, do you think they'll be satisfied and abandon those policies, or will American elections be transformed? Well, we don't want to transform elections, Ken. It's a very good question. Remember, the framers didn't want a raw democracy. They could have simply said, well, it's like France. Whoever gets the most votes wins the presidency. Or that's the way it was done in Athens and Sparta. That was Athenian democracy 2,600 years ago, right? We could have done that in the 18th century. We chose not to. Now, why? The founders had a healthy fear of raw democracy. They built us to be a republic. Checks and balances on the branches, but also appropriate safeguards on the will of the people. Because there comes a time in 200 years where the people go wild because of a depression or this, that, or the other, or riots, or you name it, and they elect a Hitler. Over time, that stuff happens. You're going to get a crazy man prop up. In 300 years of history, a crazy man will pop up. We know that's what happens, right? So there have to be checks and balances. The Electoral College is a safeguard. Then you have another safeguard. The House counts the ballot. Ultimately, only the House of Representatives can elect the president. Ultimately, the truth is that neither the will of the people nor the Electoral College mean anything. The only legal vote is on January 6th in the House. I bet you didn't know that. Sam in Maine writes, the media has been pushing Mayor Pete and Beto pretty hard, even praising them for how much money they've raised. But Bernie's already raised $18 million. And he has his own fortune. He sure does, because of those crooked deals with the lake houses in Vermont. He's a lot like Lenin, who had his lake houses despite being another socialist. He's destroying them. Is this a sign that Bernie is going to be the nominee in 2020? Well, Bernie might be the odds-on favorite. I hope he is, because I think whoever the Republican nominee is will be able to crush Bernie in the year 2020. I mean, they like Beto and Mayor Pete because they're good-looking. I've never heard, this is the first time in American history I've heard we're going to push somebody who's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and 37 years old for the White House. I think that's about as nuts as it gets. I don't know how anyone could take that even remotely seriously. I still think the race is wide open. I see no one of any real political power in the race. I think Biden is crazy if he lets the Me Too thing keep him out. Sure, he's got problems, but I think he still could be the strongest. I wouldn't want to run against Joe Biden. I think he could be the strongest in the field. He's a dynamic politician. I've known him for some time. I disagree with him. I think he's a great guy. He's been in politics since the 60s. And I wouldn't want to run against Joe Biden. He's ferocious in debate. You'll remember in 2012 when I helped prep Paul Ryan in 2012 as part of the team that prepped him for the vice presidential debate. Paul's a great guy. He was kind of smug and cocky, and he said, don't worry about this. I'm going to crush Biden. He's an old man. Biden crushed Ryan pretty hard. Ryan didn't prepare. He got a good lesson for how tough Joe Biden is. I also think the stage is set for the return of HRC. Truth is, I'll write her a check. We want her in this race. Wouldn't it be fun to run against Hillary again? All right, hit that like button. Go to BehindTheCurtainRadio.com. Jump in the ring. Square off. Now, you got to get the podcast, BehindTheCurtainRadio.com. Go to YouTube if you're there and hit the bell. All right, Cynthia now in Tallahassee tells us the border crisis has gotten so bad, yes it has, Cynthia, that even the mainstream media is admitting that there's a major problem. Yeah, that's right. Trump may not be working as quickly as we'd like, he's sure not, but the Democrats are doubling down on open border policies that are clearly untenable. Will that strategy work for Democrats? Well, the border issue is not really a general election issue. I mean, Trump will use it to rally the base. The base, if Trump is the nominee, the base will be strong for him. He doesn't really need to rally. It's larger than 2016. He'll have a lot of ways to rally the base. Sure, immigration will be one of them. The real issue could be in the Republican primary if there is a conservative that were to challenge Trump on immigration policy, because let's face it, the border policy, Trump is saying he's going to take $1 billion from DOD. I haven't seen it. So far, we're almost 3 years into the Trump presidency, I guess 2.5 years, and we have not one square mile of the wall built. President's heart's in the right place, but I want to see that wall built, Mr. President. Frank in Ohio writes, here's our Bernie question. The fight amongst the left over Joe Biden has really been interesting to watch. It sure has, Frank. But I think this campaign is dead in the water. Do you think people are right when they saw this all as a Bernie Sanders takedown? I think Biden will run. This is his last chance. He has nothing to lose. He might as well get in. Now, is it a Bernie Sanders takedown? Bernie's a real smart guy. Maybe it is a Bernie initiative. Maybe Bernie did work with that former lieutenant gubernatorial candidate. It's always strange when people report after the fact. Sure, we take sexual harassment very seriously, but like reporting any incident or any crime, as a lawyer, I'm always suspect when something happens after the fact. That is, okay, if it bothered a woman that much, why wasn't it reported at the time? And then you have these allegations that are 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, and you have to wonder, now this isn't that, this is only 3 years old. But I think you always have to wonder when something wasn't reported at the time. BehindTheCurtainRadio.com.